and to introduce this unnamed hero. The introducer is going to be none other than Farnham Jahanian, the 10th president of Carnegie Mellon University.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to extend a warm welcome to all of you this afternoon. I'm going to stick to my script because we want to hear from Jim. That's the purpose of it. I'm delighted to be kicking off this afternoon's program, of course, a chance to celebrate the incredible career of our friend and colleague, Professor Jim Morris, as he delivers one last lecture. Please join me in congratulating first Jim. I am so pleased to be joined by our faculty colleagues, students, staff, and of course, former deans, Raj Reddy and Randy Bryan, who've joined us. I'm thrilled to see so many of Jim's friends and family members, including his wife, Susan. Thank you very much for joining us. I have a distinct pleasure, what an honor it is as a computer scientist for me to have the distinct pleasure of introducing Jim Morris as he delivers his lecture, what he describes as a personal history of computer science at Carnegie Mellon. That is such a fitting descriptor for a life spent at Carnegie Mellon and a career spent shaping our strength in computer science here at CMU, together with trailblazers like Newell, Simon, Perlis, and of course leaders like Randy, Raj Reddy, and now Andrew Moore. As his lecture abstract points out, he first set foot on campus as a Pittsburgh native, attending Spring Carnival, what a surprise, when he was a child, more than 65 years ago. We won't say how old he was at the time. And he has worn a number of hats here at CMU, as you know, over the years. He would later enroll as an undergraduate here at CMU. He was a member of Tartan varsity football. You see the jacket right there. And also served, I bet not many of you know this, as president of Delta Upsilon fraternity. So he was a frat boy at the time as well. What an accomplished career, I'll tell you. He survived that period as well. Between his time as an undergrad and coming back to CMU as professor in 1982, he receives master's and PhD at MIT. He served as a faculty member at Berkeley, and he spent 8 years at Xerox PARC during the early days of personal computing, of course, revolution. At CMU, he's been department head, director, of course, a dean here at SCS, and of course, many of you remember he was also director of the legendary Andrew project, but I'm just scratching the surface. I think you're going to hear a lot more about these in a moment. Along the way, he's been responsible for some major technical accomplishments, the Knuth Morris Pratt KMP pattern matching algorithm. Students that are here, if you don't know what it is, you need to go home and read about it. Has been influential in the evolution of technologies and so on. Perhaps more importantly throughout his career, Jim has mentored and inspired a new generations of researchers and practitioners and academics, training them to be architects of the next wave of technological progress that we have enjoyed over the past several decades. And from what I hear, he is only retiring so that he can find time to do more things. For example, he plans to write a book about the history and legacy of CMU leadership in computer science. I've been wondering who's going to play Jim in a movie. I was asking for some suggestions, a number of comments, including from Phil, that came, and Harrison Ford was one name that came up, with Matt Damon playing the young Jim Morris. So we have some connections with the movie industry. We can send in our request now. As we look more seriously at this extraordinary career, it's easy to lose count of all the ways that Jim has enhanced our lives, both as consumers of information technology and as members of CMU community who care deeply about the use of technology to improve human condition. to wrap up, Jim, there's no doubt that you're a brilliant computer scientist and a trailblazer. But perhaps, as evidenced by the turnout tonight, you're also a remarkably generous mentor and colleague and friend to all of us. As president of Carnegie Mellon and as a computer scientist, I am profoundly grateful for everything that you have done for CMU and in many ways that you've contributed to our discipline and also to the leadership and progress that we've enjoyed at CMU. At this time, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jim to podium and give him a warm welcome reception.
Thank you.
Enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Farnham. So isn't it great to have a president who's a computer scientist? So now that everybody agrees that, it's just like all my lectures, the AV won't work. Yeah. Anyway, whoops. Now that I proved that I was on the football team, I can take this off. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about these 5 great men who have been pioneers in computer science and have been mentors to me. I would like to recognize all of you people, many of whom have helped me a great deal in the past, but the rule is you have to be younger than I am, or dead. So I just had to limit it to this group. I'm hoping to write a book about this sometime, but today is the first try at describing some of the ideas. So the leaders are Perlis, Alan Perlis, Bob Taylor, Alan Newell, Raj Reddy, and Herb Simon. So I put a timeline here. Even though I'm going to be describing my career, I'm going to talk about one person at a time, so it'll jump back and forth. And down here I've written some of the fundamental things about computing that were true in those different years. Okay, so let's begin with Alan Perlis, the first computer scientist. In 1957, Sputnik was launched. Caused a great deal of anxiety and excitement in the United States, including the notion that everybody should become a scientist. And so I said, yes, I want to become a scientist and be a physicist. I was all set to go to MIT or Caltech and be a physicist. And Carnegie Tech at the time offered me a full scholarship. I was an only child, and I was my mother's only child, and my father had died a few years before that. So going to Tech seemed like a good thing to do, and in fact, it turned out to be a great thing to do for my career. So I went to Carnegie Tech. In order to have some semblance of a college life, however, as Farnham mentioned, I did move into a fraternity. One day I was sitting at the fraternity having a beer and watching television, and a friend came in and said, "This crazy professor in my course says that anybody who's in the rat race for grades can just write the grade they want on their exam paper and he'll give it to him." I said, "Wow, that sounds like an interesting subject." What is that? Well, the subject was computer programming and the professor was Alan Perlis. So the next spring I enrolled in Perlis's class. I went to a room, I think it was in 100 Porter Hall. It was filled with hundreds of geeks. And in the front of the room was Alan Perlis. Now Perlis, as you can see, was a striking person. He had no hair on either his head or eyebrows. He started giving this enthusiastic lecture in his glib tone, and for the first of many times I did understand what he was talking about. His idea of lecturing was sort of to talk about what was amusing or perplexing him that day. So it was interesting, but a little bit hard to follow. For homework, for those of you young people, I have to explain. In order to write a program, you had to punch holes in cards, put the cards into a drawer. Cards later would be taken from that drawer and into an inner sanctum, a glass-enclosed computer room, where an operator, or sometimes Perlis himself, would feed these cards into the computer. A few hours later, a couple of pieces of paper would come back, usually saying that you'd made some syntax error, so your program didn't even run. Sometimes your program would run and give you a little information. Everybody else thought this was a lot of fun. Perlis used to give whimsical homework problems. One day it was design a language for describing motel layouts, probably because he'd been in a motel that week. Let me see here. I've got some notes. Where did I put my notes? Yeah, here we are. Right. Okay. So I went and took another class later. So this class. Oh, by the way, as far as I know, nobody in that class ever got the deal to assign their own grade, and I got a C. But my friends kept telling me that computers were the future, so I went and took another class. This time from a slightly more sober teacher. This guy said, "Well, write a program to do anything you want." So I said, "Okay, I'll try." Designing a program to control an elevator, to dispatch an elevator. One day, so I was working on that or talking about that, and Perlis showed up in this class on a visit and listened to our projects, and he suggested that I could actually kick people off the elevator halfway to their destination and come back and get them later. This confirmed my skepticism about Perlis. So anyway, so I decided to write this program, and it happened to be the Wednesday afternoon before Thanksgiving. School was closing out. I was in my room at the fraternity. I was planning to go out and meet my high school buddies later that evening. They were all coming back to town from their fancy universities out of town. But I sat down 2 o'clock in the afternoon to start writing this program on a yellow pad of paper. The next thing I knew, it was 11 o'clock. I'd finished a draft of the program, I'd missed dinner, I'd missed my friends, and I was hooked on programming, if not Alan Perlis. And that was how I became a computer scientist. Perlis was the head of the computer center, and in those days computers were a precious thing, so they were often sequestered in laboratories. But Perlis, who had been a student here, he made student computing a first priority. And he was like the Pied Piper, leading students into this new subject. He was sort of saying, "Come on in, the water's fine." He'd say, "This is an area that's going to grow. You can do almost anything, and it'll probably be successful." So it was a sort of very compelling speech. He was also internationally known. He was on committees that defined programming languages. He was the president of Computing's first academic association, the ACM. He won the first Turing Award, which eventually became the Nobel Prize, or is considered the Nobel Prize of Computing. So I said to myself, if this doofus is a big cheese in computing, there can't be that much competition. especially compared to physics with Einsteins and Newtons. I said, I think this is a good career move. So I decided to become a computer scientist. And giving up physics, I was doing the same thing as a lot of my future colleagues did. One of them was John Reynolds, who had a very distinguished career as a theoretical computer scientist here. John, not having the benefit of Perlis at a young age, went all the way through and got a PhD in physics before he became a computer scientist, but he did some great things. Now, later on, let me see. Later I became a graduate student at MIT, and Perlis came to give a talk. He'd been a graduate student there too. He talked about Formula Algol, his programming language, which did algebraic manipulation as well as computation. So at one point in the talk, he brags that his system could apply L'Hopital's rule to its program. L'Hopital's rule is an obscure trick of calculus. Well, this sort of started the room buzzing, and somebody asked, well, how often does it need to do this? And Perlis said, without skipping a beat, Perlis said, once. And he went on with his lecture. then he ran out and said, I have to catch a plane. So Alan, I think, often said when questioned or was talking to someone, would try to say the most unexpected thing he could think of. What else? Now, what was going on at this point was computer science was actually getting a lot of funding from the Defense Department. The Defense Department had also heard about Sputnik, and they started something called the Advanced Research Projects Agency. And the Advanced Research Projects Agency started sending money to professors that it liked around the country, encouraging them to entice us into computing and computer science. So it was an important thing. A man named Licklider was doing that. It was very, very important development. Now, so at Carnegie Mellon, the recipients of this money were Alan Perlis, Alan Newell, and Herb Simon. They basically were kind of running the show here in computer science for a long time. Now, Alan Perlis became the head of the computer science department because Newell and Simon much preferred to do research. But actually, Alan didn't seem to be managing very much either. He didn't hold any discussions, no meetings. He just made decisions as they came along, and they were often good decisions, and Newell and Simon were quite happy with this. So that worked out fine for many years. Perlis's motto seemed to be ready, fire, fire, fire. He just wanted to keep things moving. He didn't try to control things that much. In fact, he invented what is still talked about here at Carnegie Mellon, the reasonable person principle. It basically says there's so many situations, we can't have rules to cover every situation, so everybody, faculty and students, should do what they think is reasonable, and we'll worry about the consequences later. So it has actually worked quite well, because if you start making rules with computer guys, good luck. They're going to figure out ways around the rules anyway. He also started the institution of using this DARPA money to fund a student regardless of how much money their advisor had or what the advisor was working on. So students had complete freedom to choose whatever topic they wanted to for their research. One time the PhD students, in a very early stage of the PhD program, they complained about the structure of the program. And so Perlis had a meeting with them, and he said, okay, design something. You tell me what we should do. And they did design something and worked hard on it, and he had more or less adopted it. So the Carnegie Mellon PhD program was actually designed by people like Phil Lehman, who were students here. Whoops. That's a sure sign I'm covering. Whoops. Okay. All right. Okay, so this goes on. After I was teaching at Berkeley, there was my wife Susan was taking me on a trip to Europe to show me Europe, and we stopped at a computer conference in Bavaria. This computer conference had been organized by someone who had been in the German army during World War II. So there were some people who didn't want to be at this conference or didn't think it was appropriate. You might have thought that Perlis, who was a descendant of Russian Jews here in Pittsburgh, would be one of them, but he plunged in enthusiastically. In fact, he brought his wife and daughter to this conference. And Susan and I spent many hours drinking beer with him in the evenings at this place and kibitzing. Perlis loved to tell jokes. Here's my favorite one. On a cold winter's day, a bird falls from a nest. It's freezing cold, the bird is flapping around, and a peasant comes along and picks up the bird, starts walking along with it, wondering what he can do to help the bird. He comes across a steaming cow pie. So he digs a hole in the cow pie and puts the bird in it and goes on his way. So in time, the cow pie warms up the bird starts to sing, and a fox comes along, jumps on the bird, and eats it. The moral of the story is, it's not always your enemies who put you in it. It's not always your friends who get you out of it. But if you're in it up to your neck, don't sing. So that was a great Alan Perlis story. Anyway, at this conference, this conference featured a continuing debate between Alan and Edgar Dijkstra, a very forbidding Dutch intellectual computer scientist. They argued about structured programming and all these things, but it wasn't really about computer science they were arguing about. Perlis was an optimistic person who believed in the perfectibility of man and human progress. Dijkstra kind of believed the opposite of all of that. And in fact, there was a contradiction between their looks and their personalities. Dykstra sort of looked warm and fuzzy with glasses and a beard. Alan could pass for an extraterrestrial. Okay, so at this point, Perlis had actually given up the head of the computer science department here and moved to Yale, where he was the head of their computer science department. But he came back for the 10th anniversary, and he gave a great talk. Once again, I couldn't understand it, but it was very inspiring. He said we should have fun in computer science. And then finally, what do we have here? Oh, right. When I was working at Xerox, another 5 or 10 years later, I was having a callway conversation with my friends about Perlis, and I said, Alan was unique as a computer scientist. He understood that programming was where the action was. All the other pioneers of computer science were sort of applying their existing skills to computers, either to extend the computers. They were things like digital engineers and mathematicians and psychologists, whatever. They were either using the computers, they were in computing, but they were really sticking with their discipline. Perlis decided that software, which was a completely new thing, was a world-transforming technology. He once said to a group of people, "You guys are talking like a bunch of mountaineers trying to find out the most efficient way to climb Mount Everest. But what we really need is a way to transport thousands of people to the top of hundreds of mountains every day." So that's why he invented and worked on programming languages, because that actually gave access for many people to computers rather than just a priesthood of specialists. Let's see. Finally, as I was giving this, as I was saying this, Alan's voice comes out of a nearby office he was visiting. So I was very embarrassed. I said, "Oh, hello, Alan," and that was kind of the end of it. But I'm glad that it happened that way. I would have been too shy to say it to his face. But I'm glad that he heard that, which was sort of an unvarnished praise for him. On the 25th anniversary of the department, Alan had died. I gave a long speech, a speech even longer than this about him, and with his wife and children there. And then later we created a fund. We raised money to raise a chair in his name. Okay, so that's Alan Perlis. Okay, now let's go back on the timeline to about 1973. I'm an assistant professor at Berkeley, with all that implies. I am working like crazy, worried about getting tenure, and I'm also about to become a father. I read an article in Rolling Stone magazine about the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, which Xerox has just started. They've started this thing because they said they want to create the office of the future. The manager of this place is Robert Taylor. He had previously been a program manager at DARPA, and he had been funding all of these PhD students around the country with DARPA money, and so he knew who the best ones were and so forth. And so he was hiring all the ones that he really liked into Xerox. And so they were just accumulating all this talent. It had past former child prodigies, future Turing Award winners, future multi-millionaire Silicon Valley startup guys. It was a great group. One of these people was Alan Kay, a guy who had been famous for being a quiz kid on a national radio show when he was 10 years old or 8 years old. He was working there, and he said, "This is a very frightening place. I've never seen so many smart and creative people. These people all have track records and are used to dealing lightning with both hands." Well, I could barely deal lightning with one hand, but I wangled an interview at Xerox. So I found myself sitting across a desk from the Svengali-like Robert Taylor, just like that. And he's telling me that he wants PARC to be as great as Bell Labs. Now, Bell Labs, I should remind you, this was a ridiculously ambitious thing. Bell Labs was the inventor of the transistor, the cell phone, and the Unix system, and many other things, and they had Nobel Prize winners at Bell Labs. But that's what he said. Then he said, "Well, what makes you tick?" And he wanted to know why I did what I did more than what I had done. And what to say, I blurted out that I wanted to have computers serve people rather than corporations and governments and institutions, forgetting that Xerox was a corporation. But I think this was okay with Taylor because I got the job, despite the fact that when I gave a technical lecture to this assembled geniuses, they found a fatal flaw in one of my ideas to their great amusement, but it all worked out. So what else happened at PART? Taylor was born in Texas. He was adopted as an orphan. In high school, he was a competitive athlete and a part-time cowboy. In fact, one day, he got up onto a Brahma bull and kicked it until the Brahma bull threw him off his back. That's the kind of guy Taylor was. He entered college when he was 16, served in the Navy. He got a couple of advanced degrees in psychology, but he never got a PhD. So in Bob's only words, he'd been to a few county fairs. That was a Texasism. So I was impressed by all my PhD friends, but Bob's leadership style entranced me. He could manage computer geeks much more easily than he could herd cattle. We of course, all our egos were wrapped up with how smart they are, but Bob's ego was aimed at something else. He was like a football coach who had accumulated the best talent available and had nurtured this talent and had deployed it to win things. And in Bob's case, winning often meant challenging IBM. So we worked hard, very hard. He was very demanding. He actually encouraged a lot of technical arguing among us, which could have gotten completely out of hand. But he insisted that if you were arguing with somebody, you had to explain, you had to give a comprehensive description of what they were thinking and why they believed what they believed. If you couldn't do that, you weren't allowed to argue with him. So that worked pretty well. He never actually got down and fought with anybody about technical details because he had all these brilliant people around him. But he did, one way or the other, guide us to his vision of interactive computing. So in the end, after about 5 years, we created a computer system that consisted of networked personal computers. Now this was in the 80s. No, this was in the 70s, sort of long before everybody else. Well, at that time, all computers were giant things in basements. So here's a picture of the Alto system. Now, so we were all researchers, and we got these in our offices, which was a new first. I showed this to my mother-in-law, and she thought it was a television set on top of an air conditioner. I had to tell her it cost $20,000 before she would be impressed. So Xerox arranged to give spread these things around. They gave systems, a bunch of the computers and print servers and file servers and Ethernets. They gave them to MIT, Stanford, and Carnegie Mellon. I think the University of Rochester too. But true to form, MIT seemed to have ignored them. Stanford commercialized them and turned them into a company called Sun Microsystems. And the CMU people just loved playing with them and did lots of interesting experiments on them and sort of began to say, we'd like a system like that too. So Bob was wonderful to work for. He was a joy to work for, but he was a hell on the organization. He was hell on the organizations that employed him. He was so competitive that he sort of attacked all the organizations around him and demanded that his boss give him more resources. So when he resigned from Xerox and went to work for Digital Equipment, I think the people at Xerox were relieved. And then when he retired from Digital Equipment, I think those people were relieved. Let's see. Oh, right. So then when he did retire, after being at Digital Equipment, he became a bit of a curmudgeon. He lived in a beautiful house up above Silicon Valley, and he didn't even want to come down. He would only come down to get his standard poodles clipped every couple of weeks. He just liked to stay there. He used to complain a lot about people taking credit for the internet because he had in fact started all that research long ago at ARPA. He had been the first person to propose an internet-like system at ARPA. Now, hundreds of people contributed to it after that, but he was really the beginning point. He received a couple of awards. The Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers von Neumann Award was given to him, as well as the Presidential Medal of Freedom. But both of these, he had to go to Washington to pick these medals up, and he refused to go. In fact, in the case of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, he said, well, Bill Clinton, when he's out here visiting his daughter Chelsea at Stanford, he can drop it off at my house. Bob's obituary, a couple of days before Bob died, he sent us all an email thanking us for being his friend, and it ended with his standard tagline, "Write if you get work." Another Texasism. His obituary appeared on the front page of the New York Times above the fold, and it said, "The innovator who helped create PC, internet, and the mouse." And he really did help. In the case of the mouse, that was invented by Doug Engelbart, but Doug had found it, or Bob had founded it. But he was really a key person, and a key person not only in my life, but in all of computing's life. Okay. Now, let's see. The timeline goes back to like 1961 when I was a junior, maybe a sophomore at Carnegie Mellon. Perlis had convinced me to become a computer scientist, but there were some other great computer scientists here who I was very impressed by. One of them was Alan Newell, who always taught graduate students, so I enrolled in one of his graduate seminars. Now, Alan was a big guy. He was a former football player. He had a bad back, so he hardly ever sat down, ever. So he was really kind of a giant. Very jolly giant, but a giant nonetheless. So he was in the class, and he said, the class started with, he said, well, I've got this paper, biology paper I read that shows how your heartbeat is affected by your breathing and exertion. Then he started scribbling scary-looking differential equations on the board. And I said, oh boy, I'm just overwhelmed. But then he said, but I'm only a cognitive psychologist. I don't really understand all of this, but maybe somebody can figure it out. So that's the first time I realized that he had a huge amount of courage about just jumping into any topic and trying to understand it, even if it wasn't his specialty. Most people in our business narrow down so that they know every single thing that they ever talk about, but Alan was not that way. He was willing to take on any professor or any intellectual anywhere. Now, I think that was a natural to him, but it was probably also helped by the fact that Herb Simon was his mentor. Herb had discovered Alan at the Rand Corporation one summer, decided he was like one of the smartest people he had ever met, said, come to CMU, to the business school where Herb taught, be my graduate student. They did some breakthrough work in artificial intelligence at a very early stage. Simon said, okay, that's good enough for a PhD. Here's your PhD. Now I'm going to make you a full professor, and that was sort of the way Alan's life went at Carnegie Mellon. Simon, as I'll get to in a while, was a very powerful guy. He was actually on the board of trustees at the university, which is sort of unheard of. Getting back to Alan's style, in this seminar there was an obnoxious graduate student named David Parnas. David eventually became a software engineering guru, but he was in this seminar, and Alan said to him, are you willing to give a presentation next week? Parnas said, well, if you twist my arm. So Alan, always open to a joke, he walks over and starts twisting his arm until he says yes. On another occasion, he was in a PhD oral, and the student who said, I've designed this computer system, but it would take too long to implement. Alan said, we could implement that in a weekend. And he then proceeded to stay up for 24 hours to prove himself right. Now, when Alan met Fred Rogers for the first time, might have been the last time, he said he amused himself by going after Fred Rogers because Fred was cruel because he didn't respect the feelings of robots. Now, I don't know if Rogers knew it was a joke, but Alan thought it was fantastic and always talked about it. Because anyway, they were serious about these robots. What else? In this class I wrote a paper about neural nets as a model for computation. In fact, one of the papers in the neural nets was by Manuel Blum, who was a young graduate student at MIT at the time. But Newell attacked this paper ferociously, and he sort of made me think, well, he's really not such a nice guy. But what I learned fairly quickly was he was a nice guy, but when it came to intellectual matters, he took no prisoners. He wanted things to be right. He wanted to argue about things. He was a real scientist that way, and his attitude has percolated through CMU over the years. Let's see, how am I doing on time here? Started at 3:30. Okay, maybe we'll make it. So later in the 80s, the universities came to realize that computers just weren't laboratory instruments or curiosities, but they were as central to the university's mission as libraries. Now, Carnegie Mellon had already been doing that. They'd had computers everywhere, but other universities were just catching up. Well, being competitive, the people at CMU and Newell said, we have to do something really big about making computers ubiquitous on campus. Let's have a personal computer system, sort of like the Alto. Let's have that for the entire campus. So he went to the president, Sart, and he convinced him to do that, and then he convinced the rest of the university it was a good idea. Sart went out and got an incredibly big contract with IBM to underwrite the whole thing, and so this project sort of was ready to go. Unbeknownst to me, Xerox gave me a sabbatical around that time, and Susan and I decided to come back to Pittsburgh so that our kids could get to know their grandmother, this person who didn't like my personal computer. So I found so within a few weeks, Sart had announced this Computer for Every Student project. It was making headlines all over the country, and Newell and other people were trying to convince me to take the job to direct the project. At first, I refused. I said, well, it's really a pretty big project. It's going to be politically fraught. I said, and actually, for someone who's worked at Xerox PARC, especially for Bob Taylor, it's kind of a taboo to be working for IBM, even if it's only indirectly. So Alan looked at me and he said, Jim, the thing about taboos is, when you break one, you find it's very enjoyable. That's not actually what he said, but you'll have to read my book to see what he really said. But it was too perfect. Xerox was giving up the office of the future. My friends were dispersing throughout Silicon Valley to sort of carry the vision to other companies in Silicon Valley, especially Apple. There was plenty of money. So there seemed to be no reason not to do it, so we stayed in Pittsburgh for actually the rest of my career. The name of this project, as Farna mentioned, was the Andrew Project. It was named after Andrew Carnegie and Andrew Mellon. The first problem we had was a huge battle over what the computer should look like that the students were going to use. In the first month I was working, Steve Jobs showed up in his hooded sweatshirt with this Macintosh, which hasn't even been announced yet. The Super Bowl announcement was coming later that month, or the next month. So he's sitting there showing us, up in a hotel room in downtown Pittsburgh, he's showing us this thing, and he's saying, look, you can edit text, you can draw pictures. Well, for people who use this Alto thing, that was not interesting. It might have impressed some universities, but it was obvious to me that this Macintosh was a watered down Alto in a plastic box. So I said, what about networking? Steve said, oh, Big Brother wants networking. I'm not going to provide any networking. I said, oh, yeah. But in any case, Macintoshes were not going to fly as something which is an IBM-funded project. At the same time, IBM, of course, wanted us to do the IBM PC, and the people on the staff who had recently, I'd accumulated a huge number of brilliant graduating PhD students from the computer science department to work on this project. They all wanted to use the Unix systems on Sun Microsystem boxes. So, oh boy, this was a quandary. So I went to Alan Newell for some help. He gave me some prescient advice. He said, the most important thing to get right is the network. And that turned out to be completely true. The part of the system that we did, called the Andrew file system, which Satya was one of the inventors of, is still running 30 years later, which is amazing for a piece of software. It received a national award for being a great piece of software. So that was our network part. The rest of the parts of Andrew long gone, and the devices have changed from desktops to laptops to smartphones to the Internet of Things. So that was fantastic advice. And it's only one example of the way Alan could operate in the university. He was like my childhood hero, the Lone Ranger. If there was a problem, he would come to town, do something brilliant, ride out of town and go back to his research. It was just amazing. Now he gave, Nico Haberman was a longtime department head, and Alan talked to him every week to help him be the department head. And one time Nico the whole department was chafing under the management of the college it was in. Alan spent 2 years convincing the entire university that the Department of Computer Science should become a college, which is what we have today, the School of Computer Science. This was an amazing political accomplishment if you know how universities work. So what else about Alan? Towards the end of the 80s, Alan called a meeting of a lot of people on campus. And he said, we need to have a research program in human-computer interaction. He'd just written a book with a couple of his students about this. So lots of people from psychology and business and everywhere were enthusiastic about this idea. The room was full, but nothing actually happened. I was leaving the university to go start a company, Maya Design, which had a similar agenda in the commercial space, and everybody else just went back to their research. So I think Alan was a little disappointed with me and other people at that point. Then about 3 years later, suddenly, unexpectedly, Alan contracts cancer and is dying. So I talking to him on the phone, I called him up about something, and I broke out of our professional relationship to say something lame like, well, I'm really sorry this is happening. Alan said, well, you're not nearly as sorry as I am. It was just amazing. So when he did die, it was actually, lots of people were very sorry it was happening because he had been such a powerful and guiding force in computer science. One of the people commented and said, oh, our giants are gone. So people were concerned about the future. He'd been such an important person. So when Raj Reddy, who is now the dean of the School of Computer Science, asked me to come back, I said okay, and I came back and became the head of the computer science department. A couple of other things about Newell. Oh, yeah, the first thing I did then, in a small attempt to preserve his wonderful ideas and practices, I sat down and I wrote about 8 or 9 what I called Alan Newell's precepts. And I published these things or sent them to the faculty as a way that they could sort of be guided by them even if Alan wasn't here anymore. And it was actually on a couple of people's doors from time to time. It was things like, do what you love what you do. Another thing was, if somebody else loves something, help them to do that. So because Alan was delighted, he was happy doing his research on human intelligence, but he would help with anything else because he didn't think, academics very often begin to think that what they're working on is the only important thing in the world. It's sort of what you learn when you're doing your PhD. But Alan was willing to help anybody do anything. He didn't care really about software engineering, but he helped design that program. Another one was, don't worry about how smart you are or anybody else is. So he was never frightened by somebody else being smart or irritated at it being stupid. He said, be uniformly hard, intellectually tough on everybody. And that was certainly true. And he didn't judge talent, he judged results. So that's been embedded in the Carnegie Mellon culture. One other thing about Alan. Oh yeah, the final thing I did was we went and started an HCI research program. We started a department called the HCI Research Institute. Many of Alan's friends and colleagues and students came together to create this department as part of the School of Computer Science. Raj, as the dean, blessed it. Raj would more or less bless anything I asked. And this department has been very successful over the years. Okay. Onward. So Raj Reddy, still here. So Raj has been to a few county fairs. He was born and raised in India, in an Indian village. He got an engineering degree from Australia. Then he came to Stanford and got a PhD in computer science. Then Newell and Simon recruited him to Carnegie Mellon, He made big success there, and shortly before I arrived there, he created the Robotics Institute, which has become a monster of a leadership in robotics, the biggest collection of robotics excellence in the world. So during this process of deciding to move here, I met Raj in his office. He sat down next to me, not across a desk, and he told me about his dream of capturing the wisdom of India and China, which was written in these ancient scripts, capturing them in computers and making them accessible to people. And he promised me that he would help me with anything I wanted to do at CMU, just like Newell might do. And indeed, he's done that for me. So I think of Newell, Simon, and Perlis as father figures, but Raj is my big brother. So let's see. He's made groundbreaking. He was an original speech to language guy. He could take oral. His research project, supported by DARPA, was to move from oral speech into written things, speech recognition. Very difficult problem that's been going on for a long time. He was the pioneer in that area. But his real contribution was launching the careers of hundreds of computer scientists who've gone on to greatness. Many of these are students, but some of these were faculty members whose academics career had hit speed bumps. Speed bump is a euphemism for not getting promoted. Raj would take these people and give them appointments in the Robotics Institute, and they would go on to great things. So it's really been quite amazing. Raj's his approach seems to be, if there's somebody who is really dedicated to a big, important goal, I'm going to support them, no matter how eccentric they are. And believe me, I won't name any names, but there have been a number of very eccentric people. When Nico Haberman decided to stop being the dean of the School of Computer Science to run the Software Engineering Institute, Newell held a meeting of all the senior faculty to find somebody to take over temporarily while the university searched for a new dean. Nobody in the room wanted to do it, but it was obvious that it should be Raj to do it. So we then had to spend an hour. Raj would keep proposing new names for other people, and we would spend 10 minutes convincing him that that person wasn't acceptable or wasn't good enough. So finally, at the end of the meeting, Raj said, okay, I will do it for a year. So this year goes on. I was having a meeting with Newell and Simon about something else, but then at the end of the meeting, they started talking about Raj, and they said, well, you can never be sure what Raj is up to, but we think he's doing a great job as dean. We think he should be the permanent dean. We need to make that happen. And what I realized later is they were just bringing me into a decision they'd already made, because I was also a candidate for the dean. But anyway, Raj became the dean, and he was a great one. He continued raising lots of money. He created new departments. He was a lot like Perlis in the sense that somebody wanted to do something, it seemed like a good idea, and it wasn't obviously going to blow up the university. I used to say, if it's cash flow positive and doesn't involve felonies, you can do it. So anyway, he supported all kinds of things, creation of the HCI department, I think probably the machine learning department. We expanded the college greatly during that time. It was also one of the dean's jobs is to extract the maximum amount of money you can out of the central university. And unlike me, who used to walk around with a spreadsheet trying to prove things, Raj was just a master at this. First of all, better than any tax accountant, he could find loopholes in the university accounting system which would allow us to cause more revenue to flow to our college. When that didn't work, or the university got wise to it and changed the rules, he had so much charm, he just could convince these guys. They just loved, in the end, they were very happy to make his budget bigger. I remember there was one meeting with the chief financial officer of the university, sort of a periodic meeting to check our budget. I thought we were going to get a spanking for running over our budgets and doing all kinds of things. But before the meeting, Raj is standing there talking with this guy about the great trip they had just had to Italy or somewhere where they had enjoyed so much each other, and the guy was in a really good mood. He never even brought up the deficit. The meeting ended. Raj was So, there's the old saying, you can catch more flies with honey than vinegar. And everybody knows that, but Raj kind of demonstrated that in the hands of a master. He had the chutzpah of Perlis with the grace of Newell. So nowadays it seems that Raj is on a constant around-the-world flight. He stops in various capitals to meet presidents and prime ministers. He doesn't go below that level. He gets awards. He runs one or two universities in other places. He's the chancellor of some university in India. He stops in Pittsburgh usually to have. He and Anu give fantastic parties for all his friends. Then he goes on again. Sometimes he just lands in Pittsburgh, stops at Pittsburgh International Airport. One of his minions will come up with a suitcase full of clean clothes. Raj will give him dirty clothes and get back on another plane. It's happened. I know it's true. Okay, well, oh my gosh. Okay, we're going to have to speed up. Herb Simon was less approachable than Newell and Perlis, but he was a kind person, and he was a big presence in my undergraduate life. He gave a lecture, I could probably remember where it was. I think it was over in, whatever it was, Scaife Hall Potato Chip Auditorium. It was about how to be creative. He gave beautiful lectures without pictures or notes, and he told us how Galileo had used repurposed a microscope to become a telescope and look at the stars. And then he said that he and Newell were using the computer, which was a new tool, to test psychological theories. Then he told us about Bobby Fischer, the famous chess champion. He said Bobby Fischer is actually not a genius, but before the age of 14, he played more chess games than anybody ever played in their life, even grandmasters. So Herb's idea was that is kind of a fundamental belief in him is that genius wasn't magic. It wasn't based upon some magical property of your brain. It had to do with practice. And so he, long before Malcolm Gladwell, he said that if you want to become world class at something, you had to spend 10 years at it. And his ideas that artificial intelligence, of course, are based upon that. Intelligence isn't mystical. You can explain it by behavioral patterns. Okay, so the only conversation I really had with him as an undergraduate, he was trying to convince me to become a graduate student in his new psychology department, and I was planning to go to MIT. So the conversation more or less ended when he said, "Young man, you have Charles River fever." Now, what that means is, if Charles River fever means you're in love with either Harvard or MIT or both. Newell and Simon actually were often resentful of MIT and Harvard and what they called their automatic presumption of greatness. Newell, they actually believed that if they said that professors who left CMU to go anywhere became less productive. Simon told me that my scientific career would be better if I stayed at CMU, and he was right. But I wanted to extricate myself from Pittsburgh. So I went to MIT. Very impressive place. I heard talks by Norbert Wiener, and I located the building where MIT's DARPA money was flowing into, and I sort of went searching for the computer science people there, and I found the laboratory of Marvin Minsky, who was a famous artificial intelligence pioneer. And so I found him. He was sitting in front of a big computer with a big display, amazed by something on the screen. I told him I come from Carnegie Mellon and I wanted to sort of get acquainted. And he was polite, but I definitely got the impression that the presumption of greatness was about him and not me. MIT was a great place, but it has a chillier atmosphere than Carnegie Mellon. Newell was a very combative person. He would berate any professor who suggested that there was something humans could do that computers couldn't. He would get into journalistic back and forth duels of papers arguing about his theories. He would come to computer science, sometimes in computer science department meetings, he would go on about people's ridiculous trust in mathematics. He would, is this working? All right. Now, the thing about mathematics was he was a good mathematician himself, but he didn't like that neoclassical economists were not listening to his theory of bounded rationality. His basic fundamental idea, which is now very powerful, is that humans are not that smart and they don't have that much time to make decisions, so they have to satisfice. They just have to decide to do the right thing based upon rules of thumb, whereas neoclassical economists believe that humans are rational and have all the time in the world to make decisions. So he really complained about that. But he was a fighter. He was a kind person and everything, but like Newell, if it was an intellectual thing, he just wouldn't stop. He was, let's see. Oh, one time in a faculty meeting, I said, there's this guy in my group, I think, who was visiting from another university. I think maybe we ought to consider hiring him. He's a reasonable guy. Simon looked up and he said, we don't want reasonable people. We want people who disrupt their fields, who change the direction of everything. So I said, oh, okay, next time I'll say the person can deal lightning with both hands. So he, one time he came to a party, a lunch party Susan and I were having for the department. He was a little bit late and he apologized and he said, Dorothea is still at church, but I was working on the computer. I guess that's my God. Herb remade the university. At the memorial service after he died, I looked around the room and it was filled with brilliant workaholic approximations of Herb himself. People he's hired, people they hired, people those other people hired. Really changed the university in an amazing way. It might not have happened except for Northumberland Avenue. Let me explain. In Herb's biography, he says one of his favorite things to do, his best thing in his life, was walking back and forth to the campus from his house on Northumberland. But it was more than that. He basically kind of mistrusted. I should mention, he came to CMU with a lot of brilliant people to start the business school. And when the business school became kind of famous, it was called GSIA at the time, they invented or pushed the idea of scientific management. Well, when MIT and Stanford got wind of that, they said, that's a good idea, so they just came to CMU and tried to hire everybody. And this brain trust basically left, except for Herb. So he stayed, I think because of Northumberland Avenue, but also because he was kind of suspicious of people on the coast who chased fame. He said, somewhere in his biography, he said, I was never famous, but most famous people followed everything I did. So, let's see, just a few more things. A visiting journalist once came by and said he thought that there should be a statue of Herb down in front of the Carnegie Institute here, down on Forbes Street, to go along with Shakespeare, Michelangelo, Galileo, and Bach. Now, I thought that was a little bit over the top, but now I'm not so sure. This artificial intelligence thing has gone from being sort of conceit of science fiction to a joke, to something that kind of works, to something that now some people think are threatening humanity. So this is a very big thing. And Herb, I suppose, would be happy to see that many of his predictions have come true, but I wonder what he would say about the long-term future about this. So he never had what I would call an Oppenheimer moment about maybe this thing I've invented wasn't such a good idea, but here's something he did say. I've sort of written it all out here, so I'm going to read it. But it's an interesting statement. He said, the definition of man's uniqueness has always formed the kernel of his cosmological and ethical systems. With Copernicus and Galileo, he ceased to be a species located at the center of the universe, attended by sun and stars. With Darwin, he ceased to be the species created and specially endowed by God with soul and reason. With Freud, he ceased to be the species whose behavior was potentially governable by rational mind. As we begin to produce mechanisms that think and learn, he has ceased to be the species uniquely capable of complex, intelligent manipulation of his environment. I am confident that man will, as he has in the past, find new ways of describing his place in the universe, a way that will satisfy his needs for dignity and for purpose, but it will be a way as different from the present one as was the Copernican one from the Ptolemaic. So this phrase, needs for dignity and purpose, haunts me today as we face as Americans face unemployment, opioid addiction, and premature death. It's makes you wonder about artificial intelligence. Now, I think one answer to this is, guys, we have to give up this thing about dignity. Go and change a few diapers. Get over this dignity thing. But more seriously, I think it's really ironic that here's this university whose motto is "My heart is in the work," and people here are working 60 and 80 hours a week in an attempt to eliminate all work. So now, but a few of my colleagues, Seth Goldstein, Mark Camlett, and Illa Norbosch have begun to confront this question, along with some people from the HCI Institute. And so I want to encourage them or encourage some of you to join them. It's an important question that sort of Herb raises here. What will be the future relationship between man and humans? We can design that. We can try to design that, but what should it be? Okay, so a little bit about me. If you read the invitation to this thing, you've seen that I have probably had more different administrative jobs than anybody else in the university ever. My Carnegie Mellon friends and I would ask, why would anybody do that? And I'm asking myself that question. My retired friends from outside of Carnegie Mellon, you should understand that people at this university and most universities don't like to be administrators. It's a lot of work. So in writing this story, I said, I was trying to emulate these great leaders from the past. Do what I can to help the institution, but it's really to honor them that I was doing these jobs. Now, of course, they were impossible acts to follow. I couldn't do anything to match that, but it was an attempt to help. Now, of course, being an administrator does have its fun moments. You get to start new things, and in my case, I started new things which many other talented people really came along and made to work. They were quite successful, basically because other people wanted to do these things anyway. They just needed to have somebody say, "Let's start this." This is a picture of an aspect of one of the harder things I did working at the Silicon Valley campus. It was easy raising money and hiring teachers and teaching, but getting the Department of Highways in California to put that sign on Highway 101 was impossible. So this is me and the sign and my BMW that says JHM CMU. Another, maybe the scariest job was starting a fall semester at a time when not only Alan Newell, but also Nico Haberman completely and unexpectedly had died right before the beginning of the semester. And I was a department head, and nobody knew what was up, and nobody knew what was going to happen. Herb Simon was still around, but we were all searching for what the future would look like. So that was a somewhat scary time. Maybe the most fun time was working on the Andrew project, because there was just a fountain of money to support that thing. So, almost finished. So this talk, okay, it's taken a half an hour, or it's taken a full hour. If you were afraid it was going to take 2 hours, you can thank my wife Susan, who has helped edit this down. She's been telling me for a whole week, leave that part for the book. Don't write that. She also, being a feminist, she also pointed out that all my mentors seem to be men. I mean, it's computer science after all. But that's not true. Susan Susan had been just not my partner, but my mentor. I met Susan, let's roll the timeline back to 1958. I met Susan when she was 13 years old. Don't do any arithmetic. But she was trying to pretend she was older, prancing around her living room wearing voguish clothes. I was there pretending that I was visiting her brother, but I was actually there to check her out. I asked her for a date. She said no. Maybe because I was much too old. Maybe that's what she thought. So I said, okay. Then a couple of years later, she invited me to a Sadie Hawkins Day dance at her school, where she asked me if I would marry her. Now it was my turn to say no. She said, okay, maybe later. Let's see, a couple of years after that, she applied to Carnegie Tech's drama school. Like everybody else, she didn't get in. She said, okay, I'll go to Margaret Morrison. There she dated me and some of my fraternity brothers. Now we want you to know that the sexual revolution had not come to Carnegie Tech at that point. So then six years later, the stars aligned and we got married. So why is she my mentor? Well, let me say a few things about what she knows how to do. She worked as a journalist, and she worked as a real estate agent and a journalist for the Berkeley Gazette. When our children, Joan and Rowan, were born, she stayed home and raised them. She raised them to be strong, confident women who have excellent professional careers. They actually paid for their own graduate education. And they also have children of their own. So she did a great job at that. But when our kids got into the Palo Alto schools, she said, I'm going to become a broadcast journalist. So when Susan does something, she goes all in. She started by taking a TV production class, and then she decided that she really wanted to be in front of the camera. So she went around talking to TV stations, and until one of the a TV station manager in San Francisco said, "You're too old and you're not good looking enough." Susan said, "Okay, I'll go into radio. I could be as old and ugly as I want to." And so she went all in for that. She went to the Stanford radio station and learned the art of radio, all the production things, including how to cut audio tape with razor blades. Her first interview she scored was with Gord Vidal, the famous author. She went to NPR workshops. When we moved back to Pittsburgh, she worked at the Duquesne radio station, WDUQ I think it was called. She did shows for NPR, Voice of America, the Osgood Files. She did a lot of radio in that time. And later, after having done that for many years, she won 3 Golden Quill Awards from the U.S. Press Corps, or whatever it is, the Pittsburgh Press Club. She won so many that she threw them away when we moved. I won 1, so I kept mine. But then she started a completely new art form for college radio stations. It was called the Student Adult Panel. So she started this thing at Stanford where she called the program "What Would Your Mother Say?" The theory was that college students would like to talk to a mature woman who was different from their mother. They would appreciate getting some advice from such a person because they're away at college, but they wouldn't let their own mother know what they were up to. That turned out not to be true. They didn't appreciate advice from anybody. So when she came to Carnegie Tech, she changed the name to Talkback. These were great radio programs. One of our friends who listened to it was worried that maybe Stanford was going to lose its FCC license to broadcast anymore because these kids were letting it all hang out. Susan is a fantastic interviewer on the radio. She could talk to anybody about anything, and she'd get the person she talked to say everything, whether it was in their interest or not. It was like one of these Oriana Fallaci who once interviewed Henry Kissinger and got him to admit to being a war criminal. It was just amazing. Anyway, so she created these new research shows. But here's why she's a mentor to me. She's first of all, I've showed you she's very resilient in the face of setbacks. She just says, "Okay, I'm going to try this other thing." She's a risk taker. She's willing to start anything. She'll start conversations in checkout lines in supermarkets, but she'll start clubs, she'll start new radio programs. She's willing to start a lot of things, and she's just not afraid to risk things. So for those of you who are wondering why I've done some risky things in the past, Susan's been my role model. She coaches me, obviously she coaches me for speaking because I write these horribly dense paragraphs which nobody could even pronounce, and I have to cut them down, and she does all of that. So she's been just as much as mentor to me as everyone, but most important, she's been a great partner to me. Thank you.
You did a great job.
Thank you.